The group of seven, known as the G7, is facing increased pressure to come up with tangible interventions to revive a world battered by COVID-19. The world leaders have been engaged in a three-day summit in the UK, which is expected to wrap up today. South Africa, represented by President Cyril Ramaphosa, has been invited as a guest nation. That gathering is expected to agree on a joint declaration aimed at preventing another pandemic, among other multilateral issues. So on Friday, the leaders promised more vaccines for developing nations, but the Health Justice Initiative says this isn't enough. In fact, the organization's head, Fatima Hassan, joins us now via our video link for more on this. Fatima, great to chat to you. Perhaps let's start with what's top of mind for many people watching the headlines, and that's, of course, that statement that comes from the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. We may very well have to do away with those 2 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines in Gqeberha. It's the last thing we needed in a context where there's, I guess, grotesque vaccine inequality in the world.
Definitely. And, our view is that Johnson & Johnson owes us an immediate supply of 2 million doses of the vaccine. And they need to find the bridging stock, and they need to divert from all around the world, because those 2 million doses were meant to be in the system a few weeks ago. It's basically affected our entire rollout. Many healthcare workers are still not vaccinated, including people over 60 who are waiting for appointments. So we have to rely on the Pfizer stock alone. So there's been a real market failure, and I think a failure by the U.S. government in particular, where Johnson & Johnson is headquartered, where the U.S. government funded the research for Johnson & Johnson. And I think that Johnson & Johnson owes the South African public, as well as the rest of Africa, an explanation, and I think also an apology.
How do you envision that playing out, though? It's embarrassing, at the very least, for a country like the U.S., as you've mentioned, but it's also, ironically, a country that's trying its hardest to prove that it's past what is being called the Trump effect. They're a whole lot more diplomatic, et cetera, and they'll want to come out as the shining stallions of the fight against COVID-19.
Yes, and that's why groups around the world that are working on vaccine equity and vaccine justice this week said that the Biden announcement of 500 million doses as part of a charitable contribution towards the global south or towards low-income and middle-income countries is not sufficient, because it's only 500 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine. The U.S. government has the ability and the power within its own domestic rules and laws and context to actually take action against Johnson & Johnson and even a company like Moderna, significantly because they actually co-invested in that research. They were the ones who contributed a lot of public money to basically accelerate the research so that we can have these amazing tools that can actually save lives. And remember that, the delay in the supplies of the 2 million doses or the 32 million that a contract has been signed for with South Africa, or the 200 million doses that must go to the AU from Johnson & Johnson, every day that there's a delay, lives are being lost. So this is not a hypothetical scenario. The facts playing out on the ground shows a dire situation of a lack of access, not just in South Africa, but the rest of Africa. And we relied on companies that told us that they've got it under control, that they have enough manufacturers, that they have enough supplies, that they will be able to meet all of our demands. But clearly, the situation in South Africa, as in the last 48 hours, shows that, we put too much faith in the market, and we put too much faith in the CEOs of these companies, and they've really let us down.
Yeah. Well, geopolitics is never too far removed from the fight against COVID-19. The G7 will want to be seen to be doing something significant. But really, all that's come out are donations, which in actual fact will only really, I guess, reach their intended beneficiaries even next year sometime. What comes to mind for me is that saying around teaching someone to fish versus actually giving them the fish itself. Do these donations do anything outside of just increasing dependence on the global north for countries in the global south?
So I totally agree. We've said for the last year that benevolence and charity cannot buy you equality, that it's not a sustainable way forward. What we need is billions of doses, literally. We need billions of doses of safe and effective vaccines to go around the world, including in the global south. The G7 has said that they'll make 1 billion doses available, 500 million of which is the Biden announcement. Now, the situation in relation to the G7 is that 1/3 of the world's supplies have actually gone to G7 countries, 14% of the world's population. So there's a certain mismatch between what they are currently using, what they've ordered, or what we've called over-ordered, and basically what they're promising for the rest of the world. Meanwhile, time is running out against us. There's a socioeconomic crisis in many parts of the global south. You're seeing what it's doing to social cohesion, to levels of trust in the vaccines, to levels of trust in different governments around the world, particularly in South Africa. And so there's a serious reckoning, which we warned about in 2020, that in a pandemic, when you need multiple supplies at the same time, simultaneously, because no one life is more important than another life. People in the global north are not more important than people in the global south. So the prioritization then of vaccines has to be done on, in two ways. One is the prioritization of those who are most at risk, which is healthcare workers and people who are over 60 or over 80. And then obviously it has to be prioritized for everybody around the world at the same time. But that is not what has happened. And the donations, like you say, is really a trickle down batch of supplies that are going to come in over the next few months. Again, a drip feed of supplies. And it's certainly not going to be enough for South Africa, and it's certainly not going to be enough for Africa. So what you need is multiple licenses to multiple manufacturers. There's really no reason why Aspen should only have a fill and finish license. There's untapped and underutilized capacity in parts of the global south, including in Africa, that could actually manufacture these vaccines if they were given the knowledge and if they were given the vaccine know-how, which is why the TRIPS waiver is so important. And ironically, again, my last point on the G7 is that most of the G7 member states are actually blocking the waiver, which South Africa and India have been asking for since October of 2020 at the World Trade Organization.
Yeah. Given that then, help us understand the significance or lack thereof of Cyril Ramaphosa possibly being the lone voice in the wilderness, to use a reference from scripture, at the G7. I mean, do you expect anything substantial to come out of that?
Look, we are receiving reports that there's going to be a declaration issued this afternoon from the G7 member states, both in terms of donations of vaccine supplies, which we've said is not sustainable and is hardly going to meet the current pressing demand around the world, but also that it's going to be addressing future pandemics. And what we are saying is we're in a current pandemic right now. We have scarce supplies. We have companies that are not meeting demand, that they are not honoring their promises or contractual promises. And remember, we haven't seen the contracts, right? So nobody knows what action we can actually take against Johnson & Johnson. And I really hope that you get the head of the local office of Johnson & Johnson on your show to ask him these questions, because it's basically subject to a veil of secrecy. There are non-disclosure agreements. There are full indemnification clauses. So what recourse does an ordinary South African have against Johnson & Johnson in this current context? One wonders. And so this notion of charity is extending into our rollout. We now have 3 rollouts. We had the 500,000 supplies through a study trial, which was a quick way of trying to bring vaccines into the system, which was Johnson & Johnson. They're now offering 300,000 doses for teachers. As a country, we're not sure why teachers are now prioritized for the 300,000 batches over the people who are waiting for the SMS through the EVDS, people who are over 60. So, there's many questions that have to be asked, why some of the Sisonke stock was then given to sports officials and so-called elite athletes and others in the last 2 weeks of that trial. And so it seems like we have parallel rollouts with the minister on suspension, with the command council that is absent, and a president that is sitting around the table with the G7 leaders, all of whom who overbought supplies and all of whom are blocking meaningful access for manufacturing ability in the global south and in South Africa.
It's a long list of contradictions, isn't it? Perhaps let's try imagine what Cyril Ramaphosa ought to do the moment he lands in this country, given the long list of problems that await him, because I have absolutely no doubt that he's keeping abreast with how this complicates, yet again, the fight against COVID-19 in his country.
Okay, so let's try and take it step by step. We were promised 32 million doses at least from Johnson & Johnson via the fill and finish license through Aspen in South Africa, right? We were also promised 2 million vaccines that were supposed to come in a few weeks ago from Johnson & Johnson. One hopes that even before he gets back to South Africa, he's sitting with those leaders and telling President Biden to call up the CEO of Johnson & Johnson and say something's got to give. We've got to change the status quo because there aren't enough supplies in the system. Remember that 300,000 of the doses that are now being promised for teachers is 1% is 1% of the promised doses that Johnson & Johnson said they would give to South Africa. And so, there's a mismatch between what companies are promising and what they're, able to deliver. When he lands, one hopes that he urgently convenes the Coronavirus Command Council. We need to hear from multiple government departments what the plan is going to be, what the action steps are going to be in relation to the missing doses, and how we are going to fill that gap for people, about 2 million people who have registered on the EVDS system or are struggling to register on the EVDS who are still waiting for vaccines. We are getting reports that people in many parts of what we call the rural areas in South Africa are still waiting for vaccines. There's anecdotal evidence on social media that a lot of people's parents and grandparents are still waiting for SMSs. And then the third thing, Ayana, which I think is really important, is government has to actually call the CEOs around the table now and said, look, we've tried to trust the market. We've tried to rely on you for supplies. You've affected our entire rollout in South Africa and in the rest of Africa. Because remember, the AU is waiting for 200 million doses via Aspen of the J&J vaccine as well, because they all chose then not to use the AstraZeneca vaccine and instead chose Johnson & Johnson. So we hope that he tells the CEOs that if they do not agree to grant immediate manufacturing licenses to as many manufacturers as possible so that we can scale up manufacturing, that the South African government will start to take compulsory measures against these drug companies.
And I wonder what those look like in the midst of the secrecy you've just pointed out. Fatima Hassan, thanks very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Fatima is head of the Health Justice Initiative. Appreciate your time once again.